Welcome to Discovering Joy with Roy, Part 3, the New Testament book of James. I'm Roy Lawson, and I'm glad you're with me. Before I go on, though, let me encourage you to hit the pause button so that you can read the first 12 verses of the 3rd chapter for yourself. Then when you've finished, hit play. I'll wait for you. Welcome back. In 1985, when I was old enough to know better, I reached a milestone in my life. For most of the years of our marriage, I had yearned to ride a motorcycle. But I hadn't been allowed. Joy said, not until you get the kids raised. If you want to kill yourself after you get the kids raised, that's okay. But not until then. So, when our youngest child, Lane, was spending his senior year in high school as an exchange student in Germany, and there were no other kids at home, I went out and got myself a motorcycle license. Then Mike Pryor of our church staff became my biking partner, and the two of us took off for my maiden voyage. He borrowed a bike from a friend so that I could ride his Yamaha, big bikes. From Mesa, Arizona to Prescott to Jerome to Sedona to Flagstaff to Payson. Nearly 400 miles that day. Not bad for a beginner. One of the great days of my life. Afterwards, I told lots of people about it. And instead of saying, congratulations for achieving your goal, I'm so happy for you, they said, you fool. In fact, one otherwise lovely lady in the church said of her husband, John got his first motorcycle when he was over 50. And I called him an old fool also. A lot of them, too many of them, pointed out how dangerous it was. And of course it was. The one who got to me was the woman who said, do you know how many people depend on you? That sobered me for the moment. I had to admit what I was doing was dangerous. But they shouldn't have abused me. At the time, we were studying the book of James together, and I knew what was coming. I'd get my revenge. What was coming was the 3rd chapter of James. Here's the deal. I knew that motorcycling involved a certain amount of danger, but according to Scripture, those people, my critics, had been carrying around something far more dangerous than a motorcycle, the tongue. You just read today's passage. Want to criticize me now? James has touched on the dangerous tongue before. Remember chapter 1, verse 19. My dear brothers and sisters, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry, because human anger does not produce the righteousness that God desires. He repeats himself a few verses later. Those who consider themselves religious and yet do not keep a tight rein on their tongues deceive themselves, and their religion is worthless. He gets right down to where we live, doesn't he? Well, you're right. I was being a little foolish with my biking, which I kept on doing for 25 years or so. I have a cane to prove it. But listen to this. No human being can tame the tongue. It's a restless evil full of deadly poison. No human being can duck from this verse because we all have tongues. The Bible makes pretty clear that if we are unable to control our tongues, or if we allow our tongues to be used as tools of the devil, we're in danger. And we're dangerous. There's an ancient Greek myth about Achilles, the almost perfect man. When Achilles was a baby, his mother dipped his whole body into the river Styx. She held him by his heels. The water worked its miracle. From then on, nothing could harm Achilles because of the protective powers of that river's water. He grew up and had a valiant career as a soldier. But one day his enemies got him. There was one man who knew that the heel hadn't been immersed. So he shot him in the heel, his Achilles heel. And that was the end of him. Now you know where I'm going with this. Our church practices baptism by immersion. were dipped into, buried in the water. I've lost count on the number of people I've baptized. But I have to admit, every one of them had their mouths closed. That part, the tongue, didn't get wet. And that failure is obvious in some Christians. Their tongues aren't very spiritual. Now, you've already known me long enough to know this lesson isn't directed at you, but at me. All my life, my tongue has got me into trouble. So today's scripture makes me squirm. The first words are about me. Not many of you should become teachers, my fellow believers, because you know that we who teach will be judged more strictly. Anyone who is never at fault in what they say is perfect, able to keep the whole body in check. Well, you've already discovered I'm often at fault. Yet here I am presuming to teach. The biography of one of Russia's greatest czars, Peter the Great, reports that when Peter was only 5 years old, his guardians decided it was time for him to be educated. His parents selected Nikita Zotov, a clerk in the tax collector's department, for the job. He was an amiable man, a literate man. He knew the Bible. They thought he was the perfect choice. So the boy's mother said to him, "You're a good man, well versed in Holy Writ, and I entrust to you my only son." Nikita Zotov fell to his knees and said, "I'm not worthy to look after such a treasure." She lifted him up, reassured him, and in time, Peter became one of the most enlightened of all Russia's rulers. That is Zotov's spirit, captured me. I am not worthy. Well, who is? 3 little children grew up in our house. They were our treasures. We cared about their teachers because we cared about them. We understood as parents that not everybody ought to be a teacher. I often meditate on this passage when I'm preparing a sermon or a lesson. How dare I presume? I know James is right. I'll be judged more strictly, and I ought to be. This was an issue in the early church. In fact, much of what we have in the New Testament, we have because there were some bad teachers in the church. Some were teaching you couldn't really be a Christ follower, a Christian, unless you observed all the Jewish laws. Couldn't be a Christian without being a Jew first. That teaching would have barred the doors for most of us. And some taught you had to work your way into heaven, earn your salvation. Still others taught that the body itself was evil, so the Lord couldn't really have been in a body, he just seemed to be. And there were numerous teachers who said, in effect, do as I say and not as I do. I once had a speech professor who was effective in many ways, but he lost some credibility when he lectured us on how irritating it is to listen to a speaker who always said, He called it vocalizing pauses. And while he was telling us not to we counted 133 uhs, or something like that. Now, of course, he'd be like saying like between every phrase, like today. I remember that lecture because of what he was not doing. He was not practicing what he was preaching. We've all had such teachers. Do as I say, not as I do. In the church, we can't afford such teachers. We must practice what we preach. So, not just anyone should presume to be a teacher, and let those of us who do teach do so with fear and trembling. Here's the Apostle Paul on the same subject. Some have departed, that is from the command to love, and have turned to meaningless talk. They want to be teachers of the law, but they do not know what they're talking about or what they so confidently affirm. Well, that's clear, isn't it? A friend once encouraged me to read the autobiography of Harpo Marx with the ironic title, Harpo Speaks. Now, you have to be of a certain age to know what I'm talking about. You may have heard of Groucho Marx and the Marx Brothers. Groucho became a famous comedian, movie star, and talk show host in the early days of television. But his brother Harpo never talked. That was his shtick. He never talked. But he tells all in his book, and he recounts how the Marx Brothers got their start in show business. Their mother bought a piano. The family didn't have any money, but she had a plan, which was that the boys would go into show business as musicians. Chico, who was older than Harpo, got to take the piano lessons. The deal was that he would practice real hard, and then he would teach Harpo what he learned. It didn't work. Chico practiced, but he didn't pass on what he had learned, so Harpo had to learn on his own. Now, it turns out it was a good thing, because Chico's teacher only knew the right hand. Every now and then, he would ask, well, what does the left hand do? And she'd smack him on the knuckles on the right hand with a ruler and say, that hand's where the music is. So Harpo said, Chico became, at the age of 13, the best right-handed piano player in that whole part of New York City. But he only knew half the truth about the piano's ability. The moral of the story? Don't try to be a teacher if you're only half right. If you don't know how to say, on the other hand. James here is not saying, don't become a teacher because you might not know enough. You can learn if you will. Or you might not have enough skill. You can develop that if you will. Here's what he's saying. Don't presume to become a teacher because you have a tongue. You aren't perfect. You may mislead by your tongue. I get that. I've always preferred teaching to preaching. And now I have to admit, I prefer teaching in person in a classroom to teaching online for the same reason. When I'm teaching live, you can interrupt me. Wait a minute. I don't understand. Or you can ask, did I hear you right? Or even, I think you're wrong. It's so easy when preaching or teaching for something wrong to stumble out. And I wouldn't even know. I've made a mistake. I've made some doozies that I didn't know about till later. James has something even worse in mind here. Something more dangerous. The tongue can do grave damage when it is deliberately used incorrectly. Tyrants understand this. So do bullies. James has all the way through this book expressed his concern for other people and for what we do to other people. Here it's what we do with our unbridled tongues. There was a famous jazz soloist by the name of Wild Bill Davidson. A reporter once asked him, Mr. Davidson, when you start on a trumpet solo, what do you think about? And he answered, man, I don't think about nothing. I just blow. I don't have a trumpet, but sometimes I too just blow. And it's not a good thing. Joy and I have been married long enough I can tell this story now. When our marriage was young and we were learning how to talk to one another, we had a pretty intense conversation. I don't remember what we were arguing about, but I do remember saying, woman, be reasonable. And she retorted, you know I can't be reasonable when I'm mad. Now on this point, the truth is, neither can I. When we're angry, the tongue takes over. We don't think nothing, but we do lots of blowing, emoting. That's when the fire starts. You can take college courses on how to become fluent speakers. They don't offer any courses on how to become fluent listeners or on how to curb the tongue. One teacher of preachers said he once saw an advertisement about a course called Develop Your Personality. And the subtitle was, How Silent Sims Became a Fluent Talker. Well, what is needed is a course in how to make the fluent talker into silent Sims. I agree with the man who said, those of great minds discuss ideas. People of mediocre minds discuss events. And those of small minds discuss other people. James draws three pictures on the power of the tongue here. The bit that enables us to make a horse go where we want. The small rudder of even large ships that the pilot uses to steer in the right direction. And the spark that can set a forest on fire. I can picture all of these. I grew up in Tillamook on horseback. I can't remember when I didn't ride. And Tillamook is a fishing community, so I spent a lot of time on the water. I know about rudders. So do you. And I have a memory of some of Tillamook's great forest fires. In fact, when I drive from the valley to Tillamook today, I marvel at the lushness of the forest. When I was in school, fifth graders had a special day each year to plant trees. The school was replacing what the fires had destroyed. Those of us who live in Oregon in 2020, we know something about fires too, don't we? When I was young in Tillamook, the hills around me were blackened. Charred stumps were all that remained. We've seen that too throughout Oregon now. I thought that was normal. Now, says James, that destructive power, that is your tongue. Is he talking about gossip? I think so. Another story from early in our marriage. Joy caught me reading Time one day, Time magazine, a very respectable news magazine. She looked it over and after a while opined, that's nothing but a gossip sheet. I had to conclude she was right. A lot of what we call news is merely gossip that's been dressed up and made respectable. Here's the truth. We might be weak in other ways, but we can have powerful, cutting, disgusting tongues. Gossip ill becomes a Christian. A word about profanity. Have you ever noticed when you want to say something nice about someone, you don't swear. You want to build somebody up, you don't use obscenities. No, the tongue really just gets going when you want to run somebody over or put somebody down or build yourself up at their expense. Don't give vent to those unbecoming, uncomplimentary, ugly attitudes and emotions that have control of you. It's not a sign of maturity to be able to use the language that dominates in R-rated movies. It's a sign of lack of control and a certain lack of imagination and a limited vocabulary. Then there's simple tactlessness. Some of us like to pride ourselves in our honesty. We let it all hang out. We let people have it as it is. That can sometimes be brutal. In fact, we say, let me be brutally honest with you. Honesty is what we're after, not brutality. Paul urges us to tell the truth, but in love. That's James' message. That's Jesus' message. Finally, lies. Simply put, don't lie. As James will tell us in the 5th chapter, 11th verse, all you need to say is a simple yes or no. You won't have to swear that you're telling the truth. We shouldn't have to say, and this is the honest truth, as if what we had been saying before that wasn't. Let the tongue, like a rudder on a ship, predictably guide you to honesty, gentility, kindness. Even though the tongue can tame animals, James writes, no tongue, no human being can tame the tongue. It's a restless evil, full of deadly poison. With the tongue we praise our Lord and Father, and with it we curse human beings who have been made in God's likeness. Out of the same mouth comes praise and cursing. My brothers and sisters, this should not be. Why shouldn't it be? He's just told us. Those we are cursing were also made in the image of God. like us. James is appealing to the golden rule, to treat others as we would have them treat us. God doesn't want some of his people cursing the rest of his people. Do you know this little ditty? There's so much good in the worst of us, and so much bad in the best of us, that it ill behooves the best of us to talk about the rest of us. Pretty good advice, don't you think? So, you want to discover more joy in your life? Take control of your tongue. Use it for blessing, not cursing, for praising, not carping, for uplifting, not degrading. A positive, God-loving tongue will bless God and others and yourself. And that leads to greater joy in your life. I bid you joy.